I think we're going to start. It's I think the turnout is testament to just what a special occasion this is for us here at the AA to welcome Sir Ken Adam. My name's Shumon Basar. If I could remind you all, turn your mobile phones off, please, now. That would be great. And I've just found out from Sir Ken that this is his first time here at the AA. And that you'll realize just how amazing that is in a little bit as we go through certain key points in his life, and that he actually spent some time not far up the road from here at the Bartlett, and is very much aware of the AA, but it does seem it's your first time here at the school. So I'm going to keep these introductory remarks very short, because in a way, Sir Ken's life and his biography is going to be the content of the conversation that we're about to have this evening. And I believe that his life and his biography is a kind of mirror of the 20th century, and indeed the history of production design and of filmmaking in the 20th century, and in a way also the effects and the legacy that we have already here in the early part of the 21st century. Sir Ken's had, I believe, over 75 films realized, so we're having to make a very necessary edit this evening. And what we're going to focus on is your inimitable contribution to, I believe, all of our imaginations, and the way in which that you've managed to create worlds that have somehow become embedded in our imagination, worlds that are not necessarily of the past, of the present, or of the future, but are kind of incredibly magical combination of all three. So perhaps just as a kind of as a refresher, we're going to start with a little compilation of some of these extraordinary scenes, images, spaces that some of us are familiar with, and maybe some are about to become familiar with. And this video compilation was made for you
for a Lifetime Achievement Award in Hollywood by the Art Directors Guild.
That's right.
Yeah, by somebody called John Wood.
I'd like us to start a year before you were born, and to just test how good your memory was. So I've got here an image of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it was, as I say, released a year before you were born.
Right.
And I'm wondering, and I thought it was an interesting point to start, maybe for two reasons. One is that biographical reason, and secondly is that you've mentioned in interviews that it's a film that had an impact on you from a visual perspective very early on in your life. And I'm wondering what else you remember about German cinema of the 20s, and particularly of Expressionism, in those early years of your life in Berlin.
Well, in those early years of my life in Berlin, I wasn't allowed to go to the cinema, see my band. And I was allowed to go to see the White Horse Inn at the theater, or go to opera and theater, but cinema, no. Once I was allowed to go to the cinema. It was a nature film, and there was a fight between a tiger and a python. And it's influenced me for the rest of my life, really. I still have nightmares about it. So the first time I saw these films was when, as a 13-year-old, I came to England.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw Caligari for the first time in London, and another one, Dr. Mabuse, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And they just bowled me over. I somehow felt that's what I feel like becoming one day, you see. Because from the age, let's say, of 14 or 15, I knew I wanted to design for either theater or films. But I could never make up my mind. And to me, the stylization of these expressionist painters to make a film was an ideal solution.
Mm-hmm.
And it really rested with me up to present day.
This is now 7 years after you were born in Berlin. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this project.
Yes, well, my father had a famous sports, or the most famous sports store, rather like tie up with Burberry's here in Berlin, and it was founded by his grandfather, I don't know, in 1860 or something like that. And he decided at some time just before, I think, the Nazis came into power, that he wanted it redesigned. And I didn't know about this at all, but he died rather early in England in 35. And I found this photograph.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea who in 1928 could have designed this glass building until many, many years later, when I was doing a film in Berlin, and I had a young research assistant, and he said, "That's a Mies van der Rohe."
Mm-hmm.
And he located a correspondence, which is a property of the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York, between my father, or his brother, I'm not quite sure, and Mies van der Rohe. And the building, of course, was never built because by that time the Nazis came into power. And we left Germany in 34.
I haven't got images here of your family house, but I have seen them. And they weren't particularly modern, but you have said that your father was a very modern person.
Yes, he was not, yes, he was modern in terms of flying in one of the first airships and trying to surprise his children by arriving in a biplane and a country place we had, and giving big parties. But he always was worried about my future. He, you know, there were 3 brothers and 1 sister, and he always thought I would be great to take over the country place we had, but he didn't have too much confidence in me. And because in a way I was a rebel too, you know. And but he tried to experiment with new things, even films, but mainly dealing with sport, except more now, film.
And has this project of Mies van der Rohe, have you seen it published anywhere else? Because when you showed me this, I had never seen it.
No, because it's, you know, and the Museum of Modern Art were furious with me when I gave them this still. They said, "Why didn't they know about it?" I said, "It's not my problem." You know?
They should have done their homework.
Yeah, they had a great exhibition of Mies van der Rohe. And, you know, I didn't know they were that interested. But it's so typical of museums, you know, do nothing else but research, you know, and have the most fantastic library. And I was an innocent victim somehow.
With a missing me stashed away.
Yeah.
Okay, and now moving forward, and there are 2 dates here. One is 1933 and one is 1934. Obviously in 1933 Hitler came to power in Germany, and in a sense Germany ceased to be what it had been up till that point.
Right.
One of the big events, of many events I'm sure, during that year was the closing of the Bauhaus. A year later, you with your family move here to London, and obviously you weren't the only ones to become refugees here. Many of the teachers, the people who are running the Bauhaus, also moved to London here at that time. And the building I put here on the right is the Isokon building, which was which opened in 1934, which is also put together by a group of emigres not necessarily only Germans. But this was an extraordinary period, almost like a first wave of modernism to hit Britain, and particularly to hit London.
Right, and it wasn't very popular
No.
in England. That was strange. And you see what happened. By this time, I was studying as an external student architecture at the Bartlett, and we were terribly traditional. And there was, you know, there in the evenings always I had all the famous professors like Richardson, who became president of the Academy, and Corfiato and all these people. And since I was a rebel, I appealed to them. But the AA at that time was the most modern university for architecture. And I, in my spare time, used to draft for the Mars Group, which was a splinter group of the Bauhaus. I don't know what MARS stands for, but you probably do know.
Modern Architectural Research Society.
Like. And so that was the first time I really came into contact with modern design. And also one of my bosses in the architectural firm I was articled to was somebody called Quine Lay, who had been, I don't know, assistant or more than that to Mendelssohn. So he used to push me all the time because I was so depressed at the Bartlett, you know. When I did my testimonies of study and worked 4 weeks on a reasonably, modern building, and Richardson came in and he said, very good, very good, very good. And in 15 minutes, there were only red lines, 4 weeks of work, you see. And Quine Lay said, don't worry about it, you know. They respect you all the same. You know. And he had a great sense of humor when he made that verse about me. Adam, so we are told, suffered a bit from a cold. Now he's taken to wear post-impressionist hair and a tie with surrealist folds. I've never forgotten it.
And am I right in thinking that one of the reasons that took you into studying architecture was not that you necessarily wanted to be an architect?
No.
But you had an interesting encounter with Vincent Corder.
Right. Yeah.
Who was at the time one of the most progressive art directors working, who famously did Things to Come.
Right.
And he told you something that kind of helped you make your decision.
Because I was, I think, about 15 years old, and he said, if you want to design for films, I advise you to have a grounding in architecture. Because he said, I started as a painter. Several art directors did start as painters, but he said, I think an architectural background is more useful. And that's why I studied architecture, really. Never completing my studies because the war broke out. Yeah.
And you've also mentioned somewhere that one of the distinctions at that time, anyway, between art directors who were working on cinema and those who were working in the theatre was that often those working in the theatre came from more of a fine arts background, a painting background.
Yeah. Yes, also they really had to be, in a way, more imaginative, because as a theatrical designer, you've got a stage and you are bound by the limitations of your sight lines and the live public and so on. So you had to invent whatever you put, which appealed to me. But at the same time, film appealed to me too. And eventually, I think, I came up with a solution which satisfied me and possibly was one of my most successful design period in films, when I started, like the War Room and Dr. Strangelove, creating completely imaginary sets, but which the public accepted as reality.
Mm-hmm.
And there is that anecdote that, which is true actually, that President Reagan, when we became President of the United States, asked his chief of staff to look at the War Room. And the same in some of my Bond film designs, doing the interior of Fort Knox, because when I saw the exterior, which was dull, Art Deco, 1921 or 22, I thought, well, this gives me a chance, to show gold. It's the biggest gold depository in the world. So I designed a set about 60 feet, 50 feet high at Pinewood. And I'm talking about things which are not on the screen.
I'm going to rein you in now, otherwise you're going to give away the whole thing. I think just to go back to your education and these formative years, because I think it's very interesting that within the space of a day, you were spending the day at C.W. Glover's, which was an architectural firm.
In Gower Street.
Which had which, as you said, one of the partners was quite modern at the time, right? And had worked with Mendelssohn.
Yeah.
And then in the evening, between 6:30 and 10:30 every evening, you're at the Bartlett,
right,
where they're still espousing the Georgian style that we're sitting here at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems fascinating that you're getting those two very different stylistic inputs every day.
Yeah. Yes, but I was also a rebel, you see, which in a way did appeal to people like Richardson and Corfiato, because, I was upset. I mean, when all my work, after 4 weeks for the deadline was redlined, but at the same time, I don't regret it, because it was really a very useful base for my future as a film designer.
I'm sure people here would be interested to know what you heard about the AA and whether you knew people at the AA at the time when you were at the Bartlett.
I can't remember, but I heard. But we knew that at that time, without any doubt, the AA was the architectural school or university. And the Bartlett were old, has been, Richardson only liked Queen Anne or Georgian, and he said, if you design something in Georgian, I'll pass you, Whereas the AA was considered very modernistic at that time.
And you mentioned the Mars group, and you would sometimes spend the weekends drafting for one of them.
Yeah, they did car parks or something like that I was working on. Or underground garages.
And how aware were you that London was a kind of laboratory at that time, architecturally speaking or design-wise?
Well, I tell you, I had friends who were living at High Point in Highgate, so that was a very modern building. And there was a Bauhaus building on Frognall in Hampstead, which I quite liked, but the press and didn't like very much. And I think that is probably why all the famous Bauhaus architects went to the United States and became, symbols of... I myself stayed in a Neuter house in Malibu in California when I was doing it. And unfortunately in this country, it didn't go down too well.
To put it lightly. It's fascinating to imagine what would have happened if the context here was more receptive and that generation hadn't emigrated to America. History would have been very different.
I think so, maybe. Yeah.
And it was actually through one of the partners, the main partner at the office you were working, Glover, who helped you avoid internment when World War II started.
Right.
And you were enlisted eventually in the Air Force, becoming the only German national, still at that time, to be flying for the RAF.
Yeah. Then I got my younger brother, who was interned, out of internment. And you could, as an older brother, apply for your younger brother to join your squadron.
Mm-hmm.
And so he joined, not my squadron, but my wing, my fighter wing.
I'm wondering, obviously you flew considerably at that time, and I'm wondering whether flying and that sense of space and imagining the world that you saw from the airplane somehow contributed to your imagination subsequently.
Well, I mean, only flying or acrobatic flying, I adored. I was sort of a born pilot. But, wartime flying, which was a different kettle of fish, I was very scared at times. And particularly when we became rocket typhoons, which meant that we were used like helicopters now, or like gunship helicopters, to dive at speeds between 500 and up to 600 miles an hour onto German positions and release our rockets. And at first we thought this was going to be a piece of cake, but we found out soon that it wasn't a piece of cake, because even though we were probably the most important weapon at D-Day and after D-Day to attach to the army, but we had proportionally almost as many losses as Bomber Command. Mm-hmm. And I still hadn't got my commission, but now we're talking about something else. And eventually I got really pissed off, and I said to my commanding officer, who was the New Zealand Wing Command, I said, I am risking my life like everybody else here. And every time you or somebody else recommends me for a commission, I'm turned down. I want to be posted to Coastal Command on flying boats where they get eggs and bacon for breakfast, on U-boat control or something. So he said, I'll get you your commission. And I finally was commissioned with the help of his tennis partner, who was Sir Anthony Eden. So it happened just, I think, in August of 44. But I had gone through, I think if you have a lot of imagination, you also know fear. And whereas in the act of doing something, attacking something, the fear leaves you because you concentrate really on what you're doing. But afterwards, the fear sets in. Mm-hmm. And I was amazed that my greatest wartime friend, an Australian, and we used to share the same tent, and we used to have these arguments. And I said, Norman, you can't tell me that you're never afraid. He said, not in terms of that. Mm-hmm. When we went to the liberated Paris and I introduced him to a girlfriend of mine, he fell in love with her. He was shit scared. I'm sorry if I use this word. But in wartime operations, he was never scared. And he was killed, unfortunately. But I could never relate to that somehow. But I think we had...
Sure. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 50s. It was quite an important decade for you. Mm-hmm. You made the transition from art director to production designer, and you received your first Oscar nomination for Around the World in 80 Days, which I think was also an important time for you, because you got to work with the legendary William Cameron Menzies,
right,
who, interestingly, was also he directed Things to Come, but had really made his name as one of the premier production designers, and indeed was the first person to be called a production designer.
You have no stills of because I see myself in Villefranche.
No, I don't have images of unfortunately.
Yeah, that's when I was working on Captain Hornblower and designed the ship in 1946, 48,
Mm-hmm.
it was 49, yeah. But yes, what you were saying about Menzies is absolutely correct. Selznick decided to give him the title of production design by William Cameron Menzies because he actually had designed every frame of Gone with the Wind with 4 different directors, but Menzies stayed the designer. And so that was the first time the term production designer was used. And I adored Menzies, who was associate producer on Around the World in 80 Days with that monstrous but producer Mike Todd. But poor Menzies had become an alcoholic, and he was extremely nervous, and I was just starting, and we had, no money, and we had that little flat in Pond Street, and he used to come to us, and every time he left us, a bottle of scotch had gone. I mean, but Todd had that effect on him,
Mm-hmm.
and but he helped me enormously in terms of not being afraid of stylization in film design, of use of colors and I'm very grateful to him. I mean, if I talk now about all my experiences with Menzies and Todd, who was, a great showman but crazy at the same time, then I think we'll run out of time.
Be here a long time, I know.
Yeah.
But just to stay on Mike Todd for one moment, because you actually used the word that I was going to ask you about.
Mm-hmm.
You called him a monstrous or a monster, and you told me that you've worked with many, many monsters.
That's right. Yeah.
Over your career,
Yeah.
and most of them are the producers. Sometimes they're the directors, but more often or not, they're the film producers.
Mm.
And I'm wondering whether these were ever, accidental character studies for any of the Bond villains later on.
No, no, but I don't think so. But I was always attracted. This was the incredible thing. I mean, I was Mike Todd's blue-eyed boy, but at this end, he did a lot to help my career. I mean, I got my first Academy nomination, Oscar nomination, for Around the World. But at the same time, I disliked him,
Mm-hmm.
And I said, the next time he comes here, I'm not going to even see him. And then he's on the phone. And he said, I'm in the Dorchester and the Messel Suite. Get your ass over here, And I did. This was sort of contradiction in myself. But he was, without a doubt, also he was a showman.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, to do a film like Around the World in 80 Days in London, and we had some production assistant who was very close to the Queen, and he wrote to the Queen asking for permission to shoot in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, and she said, well, I replied very kindly and said, well, I can't give you permission because all the other film companies want to do it as well, but you can shoot at Wellington Barracks. And you know what Todd did when we had the changing of the guards? He told the camera to move as they were marching out into the center of the gateway so that they had to, you know.
Had to go round.
Let him get round the camera, which was unheard of, and, you know, was very serious. And then somebody sent a case of whiskey to the guards, and we got away with it. But he was completely ruthless in that way. Also, he, you know, I designed the settings in Paris, and he decided to, on the day we were shooting, to get rid of all the parked cars, not knowing that they were diplomatic cars. And the police chief of Paris was fired, and for 2 or 3 years, no foreign films were allowed to film in Paris. I mean, he was so ruthless, you know.
But in a sense, these great visionary films often needed monsters like these to make it happen. Right?
Yes, yes, yes. There are a lot of people with ego problems, you know, in film.
Not you, of course.
No, of course.
Just the last thing about the 50s, which I find very interesting, was that during the lull periods, maybe in the middle of the 50s, one of the things that you did to make some money was design a number of interiors, and particularly of cafes in Oxford.
Coffee
London,
bars.
Coffee bars.
Yeah.
And they were just taking off at the time. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you remember nobody in England or in London went to a cafe. I mean, that was Paris, you know, people on the other side of the channel. And so I designed some of the first coffee bars in London and in Oxford and in Richmond. And to earn some money, because once you decide that you want to be the chief designer of a film, and you start off, you don't immediately get another film, you know, until you've made a reputation for yourself, and even then, you know, depending on that. So I had to earn some money. So that was a good way of making things meet.
I'm wondering what style were those cafes?
Well, I mean, the one in Oxford was very modernistic. The one in the Brompton Road was like a French street. And the one in Richmond was called the Gondola, so I designed it like a gondola.
I bet
You didn't ask me all these questions before.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to, Nick, if we could have the first Dr. No clip, please, that would be great.
Sit down. Why have you disobeyed my strictest rule and come in daylight?
I had to. Bond came to see me this morning.
Yes, I know. I gave orders that he should be killed. Why is he still alive?
Our attempts failed.
Your attempts failed. I do not like failure. You are not going to fail me again, Professor.
No. I came to warn you.
Warn me.
Tell you. Bond has discovered those rock samples of Strangways came from Crab Key. He's not a fool. He's sure to come out here.
I hope not. If he does, I shall hold you responsible. I make myself clear.
Yes, quite clear.
Go to the table. You see what is in the cage. Pick it up. Pick it up. Tonight.
You told me that Terence Young, who was the director of this, the first Bond film, gave you a huge amount of freedom. And
Yes.
in a sense, you were really able to sculpt the vision of this, the first Bond.
Yes, there's no question about that. Because it was a low-budget film. I mean, the whole film was done for just under $1 million. And my set budget originally was $12,000. And then I said I couldn't do the sets for that. And the two producers then said they had some money stashed away somewhere and gave me another £6,000. So it was a very, nobody, of course, expected the success of this movie. And the set that you're talking about was really an afterthought, because I'd run out of money and completely forgotten about the set. And 3 or 4 days before we finished shooting at Pinewood, Terence Young reminded me about the set. And I thought, oh my God. And I had 570 pounds left. And so I came up with this set built in perspective on a platform, on a sloping platform, and a sloping roof, because in order to get the whole circle of that grill in, I had to do it like that. And, the cameraman, who was a friend of mine, managed to get this incredible spider effect on the walls. And in a way, it was the first minimalistic type of film set, certainly in the Bonds, because the chair, a door, and the circle, and the tracking back to the foreground table with the tarantula in it. And a number of critics eventually said that they think it was a set that set the style for all the future ones.
And to me, it seems one of the clearest in terms of being influenced by the expressionists that we were talking about before. You mentioned Dr. Mabuse, and the whole thing has this sense of Fritz Lang, the disembodied voice of Mabuse, the play with light and shadow. So that, again, your influences were whether unconsciously or unconsciously really coming to surface here.
I think that's true. Yeah. And Piranesi.
Yeah, which we'll get to in a minute. This is one of your early drawings. Can you tell us about this space?
Yeah, it was. I can't really remember that much, but it was the pump room, I think, on Thunderball. But I said, no, I don't know.
No, this is Dr. No.
Dr. No.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not convinced it is.
Okay. This is Dr. No.
Yeah, that's Dr. No. Yeah.
This is Dr. No.
Yeah.
This is the lair.
That's the lair. Yeah. Have you got a?
Yeah, we're going to show. If we could have the next clip, please.
Come and look.
Artificial light. We could be hundreds of feet beneath the sea here.
And look at that. Sea tulips. They do not grow above 200 feet.
$1 million, Mr. Bond. You were wondering what it cost.
As a matter of fact, I was.
Forgive my not taking. a misfortune. You were admiring my aquarium.
Yes. It's quite impressive.
A unique feat of engineering, if I may say so. I designed it myself. The glass is convex, 10 inches thick, which accounts for the magnifying effect.
Minnows pretending they're whales. Just like you on this island, Dr. No.
Now, a number of things are happening in that clip, which I'd like to ask you about. One is to do with the fish, and then the other is to do with, like you said, the budget on the film was relatively modest. So you were at that point having to make do. It's a kind of bricolage of things that you already had. Certain objects belonged to you and your wife, Letizia, at the time.
Yes, I sort of mixed the dressing of the design with some antique furniture, because I thought, and you know, put the tree in the middle of it. And the one problem I had, because we had no money, was we asked for stock shots of fish, you see. But we wanted, you know, sharks and something like that. And instead they were sort of goldfish size. It was a disaster.
Killer goldfish.
Yeah. And I had designed this big space, you know, to rear project or front project these fish onto, and suddenly these small fish became enormous and completely unbelievable. And that's why they had to introduce that dialogue in magnifying effect. But, you know, that's something we learned, because eventually, of course, the budgets of the bombs became larger. And I didn't make that mistake again.
It also feels like Dr. No is asking Sean Connery how much the film cost. £1 million. Well, useful, it's good to know.
But I liked, you see, what I did on the first Bond was to experiment with new materials too. I mean, have real wooden floors, have copper or gunmetal doors and things like that. And I felt it was about time that in film design one expressed our technical age. Remember, it was 1961, I think.
Yep.
And it was an age of invention, and the films didn't project that, like 20 years before, 30 years, the Fritz Lang or something like that. And nobody could watch because I was by myself at Pinewood while the unit were shooting in Jamaica. And Terence had complete confidence in me that provided you give me the right entrances and exits for the artists and actors, I leave the style to you. And I got away with it somehow.
And perhaps we could have the next clip, and as we move to Dr. Strangelove.
I think I have to, because I'm getting stiff neck.
Stands everybody here? Mr. President, the Secretary of State is in Vietnam, the Secretary of Defense is in Laos, and the Vice President is in Mexico City.
We can establish contact with them at any time if it's necessary. The undersecretaries are all here, of course.
Right. Now, General Turgidson, what's going on here?
Mr. President, about 35 minutes ago, General Jack Ripper, the commanding general of Burleson Air Force Base, issued an order to the 34 B-52s of his wing, which were airborne at the time, as part of a special exercise we were holding called Operation Dropkick. Now, it appears that the order called for the planes to attack their targets inside Russia. The planes are fully armed with nuclear weapons with an average load of 40 megatons each. Now, the central display of Russia will indicate the position of the planes. The triangles are their primary targets. The squares are their secondary targets. The aircraft will begin penetrating Russian radar cover within 25 minutes.
General Turgidson, I find this very difficult to understand. I was under the impression that I was the only one in authority to order the use of nuclear weapons.
That's right, sir. You are the only person authorized to do so. And although I hate to judge before all the facts are in, it's beginning to look like General Ripper exceeded his authority.
So Kubrick hires you on the basis of having seen Dr. No.
Right.
And you forfeit working on the second Bond film, which is From Russia with Love.
Right.
So that you can work on
Strangelove, yeah.
And very, very quickly you established an extremely close relationship with Kubrick, again,
Right.
which we can't get into huge detail because it will take a whole evening.
Yeah,
by
yeah, but
itself.
just talking about one film, yeah. Yeah.
But he was a very different director to Terence Young.
Yes, of course, yeah. You know, like a computer, really. I mean, he had an unbelievable brain and a lot of imagination. And he was brilliant, but very difficult to work with. But we were both, we got on, you know, very well. Became, I think probably he was a director I had the closest relationship ever with, but that's why he became so destructive, and I didn't really want to do another film for him. And I got out of 2001, and I got out of Barry Lyndon too. And because he said, well, I'll have to get the next best production designer. And I was very relieved. And 5 weeks later, there was a shy little Stanley Kubrick who said to me, this man doesn't seem to understand what I want. You have to help me out. And I did, but it was a mistake because, well, it's too long a story. Yeah.
I just wanted to, this is a very early sketch of the War Room.
Yeah.
And it was originally on 2 levels.
Right.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But Stanley then...
Yeah, and he loved it. It was, you know, during our first meeting, I always like to doodle on a piece of paper and something. And he loved this, and he said, that's exactly what I want. And 3 weeks later, so I had the art department at Shepperton already work on this. And 3 weeks later, because I drove him to and from the studio for 5 months in an E-Type Jaguar at 30 miles an hour. And so you got to know each other pretty well. And he said, gee, Ken, you know, what am I going to do with that second level, you know? I don't know how to use the actors. So I said, well, Stanley, you know, you should have thought about it. You know, I'm not the director of the movie. So he said, you have to come up with something else. And I nearly flipped out, you know. I didn't have confidence in those days yet. I walked in the gardens of Shepperton and took a dose of Valium to calm me down. And then started scribbling on this design. And he was standing behind me. And he said, gee, Ken, it's like a triangle. Isn't that the strongest geometric form? I said, absolutely, Stanley. And what are you going to use for material? I said, reinforced concrete. So like a giant bomb shelter? I said, yes. And so I sold the idea, you know. And then he never used that angle, you know, which is amazing. Because in the old days, I learned was the most brilliant pie fight I think ever shot. It was somehow out of, he used tricks like slow motion and so on with pies doing aerobatics and so on, and it didn't fit into the general sort of atmosphere of the film.
So it remains one of the, like a hidden...
Yeah. And then we had to come up with, you know, different ideas. And I remember the Barry Lyndon song of We'll Meet Again, which he used very effectively with the various nuclear explosions in the background. I think, I don't know, I really hope that everybody in this room has seen the film. I still think today that it is one of the best black and white satirical comedies ever made. And I know the American Film Institute considers that too. I think it's considered among the 3 best films. And it holds, you know, you can see it today. When was it shot? In
62.
60. Yeah, so that's a few years ago.
Yep.
Yeah. And it still holds
still
up.
holds,
And
exactly.
Peter Sellers, of course, was.
Oh yeah, that's something.
Yeah.
That's something else.
But it started all the bad habits of Stanley, because Peter was brilliant at improvising, and he never really read the lines of a script. He invented his own lines. And of course, the biggest problem was for the other actors not to start laughing. And when you look at the film today,
I think we have that.
have you seen of, no, that's the Pathfinder. Yeah, that scene. You see the Russian ambassador standing next to Peter, who plays Strangelove, right? And Peter Bull was the Russian ambassador, and he couldn't keep a straight face, you know. And we had to reshoot every time. And that was one of the problems. But what it taught Stanley, that he started, you know, repeating a take sometimes 20, 25 times, and in later films even more often, and then just pick the best bits from there. You know.
I'll keep just a very quick interlude, because this there's life before the Flowmaster pen, and then life after the Flowmaster pen.
Right.
Perhaps you could, because I'm sure that many students here will find it very fascinating to understand how a new piece of drawing technology, in a sense, really changed the way that you thought.
Yes, it's absolutely true. Being an architectural student, I love drawing with, you know, hard pencils and setting T-square, and I felt very safe because I could do that pretty well. And, you know, whatever one feels, even today, that discipline is good, because you know, when you design film sets, they have to be built, but they haven't got to be built like a real building, but they have to keep the same proportions and everything. And I found I was very inhibited in my drawing. I used to do projections, camera projections, that size, beautiful, accurate, and completely lifeless. And thank God I have an Italian wife who said, I don't like those big sketches. I like your scribbles which you put away, you know, into the waste paper basket. And so I knew I had to loosen up. And I started with charcoal first, and I was black all over, and I didn't like that. Then I used Conte, and even the Conte, you know, I somehow didn't quite get it. And then the Flowmaster was invented, you know, with a felt nib and a translucent ink. And at that time, I didn't realize that the ink was very poisonous, you know. Nobody had told us. And I managed to develop a style where my lines, you could, you know, by pressurizing, I could have a translucent or a solid feeling of the lines. And I loved doing it. You know, it gave me, in black and white, the three-dimensional feeling, the lighting, and so on. And it was the way I designed most of my films. And when I had the exhibition at the Serpentine, Flowmaster sent me a whole box, because I couldn't use them in America any longer because the ink is poisonous. And you shouldn't use it here, you know, with inscribed, you know, it's very nice. And sometimes I still try to use it, but it's difficult.
Let's move to grab the next first Goldfinger clip, please.
Morning, Q.
Morning, 007. This way, please.
We are busy this morning.
It's not perfected yet.
Where's my Bentley?
Oh, it's had its day, I'm afraid.
But it's never let me down.
M's orders, 007. You'll be using this Aston Martin DB5 with modifications. Now, pay attention, please. Windscreen bulletproof, as are the side and the rear windows. Revolving number plates, naturally. Valid all countries. Here's a nice little transmitting device called a Homer. You prime it by pressing that back like this. You see? The smaller model is now standard field issue, to be fitted into the heel of your shoe. Its larger brother is magnetic. Right. To be concealed in the car you're trailing while you keep out of sight. Reception on the dashboard here. Audio visual, range 150 miles.
Ingenious and useful, too. Allow a man to stop off for a quick one en route.
It has not been perfected out of years of patient research entirely for that purpose, 007.
So this introduces the Bond as a gadget-wheeling car fiend, which is not far from what you were yourself. And so already there are some of these characteristics. This is you and Letizia on the right with your E-Type, which used to drive Stanley Kubrick back and forth to Pinewood. You had a Mercedes to Shepperton. You had a Mercedes before this.
Right,
And your car has been a Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
And
let's not talk about that.
No, we'll not talk about that. It's a touchy subject at the moment. And so it must have been a real joy for you, almost like a joy of a child to...
Yes, but you also have to remember, I, by this time, had a brilliant team of assistants. And, I mean, with all the gadgets, I can come up with the ideas, but somebody has to build them and so on. And I had wonderful assistants, Johnny Steers, who did all that. And it was very easy for me to get rid of my frustrations because having had a sports car at the same time, and the E-Type had that long nose, and every time I parked it somewhere, somebody bashed in part of the nose, you see, and they disappeared. And so I put machine guns and so on. It was a wonderful way
to deal with road rage. Sales of Aston Martin shot up, unsurprisingly.
Yes,
after this.
47% after the film.
And these are some sketches of some of the other spaces in Goldfinger. This is the Rumpus room.
The Rumpus room. This is the Rumpus room when it becomes a gas chamber. So all my open spaces had to close down. And it worked pretty well, but it was pretty frightening. It gave back some of my past.
And the laser room.
Yeah, the laser room. Well, that's become a classic, of course, because everybody remembers Sean and the laser going through Sean, or nearly going through Sean.
But these are some of the most memorable spaces, and they're spaces where incredible acts of violence are played out almost choreographically.
Yeah.
So you bring together two very different moods almost.
Right.
But again, was that something where you were tapping into certain memories or experiences, like you said, particularly when it came to a gas chamber, for example?
Yeah, well, that was, that I didn't like, even though it's a very interesting set when you see it before it becomes a gas chamber. The laser room I didn't mind because I just design it. Let somebody else use it the way they want to use it. And Goldfinger was very good. I mean, in the dialogue and with Sean lying on that table, I can't remember exactly what he said, but the audience who remember the film will never forget that scene. But it's not because I'm sadistic. No.
Heaven forbid. Let's keep moving. So this is perhaps the second of your iconic interiors of spaces that you didn't necessarily have access to, like
right.
the War Room. I mean, the War Room doesn't exist, but you created it. And here's Fort Knox.
Right.
Perhaps we could see the second Goldfinger clip, please.
Well, in any case, Fort Knox.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
Mr. Ling, it is merely
We're going to keep moving, but you said at one point, in a way, I was delighted that we didn't get permission to go inside Fort Knox.
Right, yeah. Which is a very uninteresting 1920s or 21 Art Deco building, which I reproduced full-size at Pinewood Studios on the lot. But also, since nobody, including the President of the United States, is allowed inside. So I said the audience wants to see the biggest gold depository in the world, so I pile up gold 60 foot up, which is completely impractical because gold is much too heavy. But in the film, you get away with it. And after the film, United Artists got over 300 letters from irate Americans who said, how was it that a British film unit and director were allowed inside Fort Knox when our president isn't allowed? So they believed it, you see. Completely impractical, but it worked.
And it reminds me, and you mentioned him already, someone else that's been important to you is Piranesi.
Yes.
But particularly in the way that they're spaces that don't necessarily work, but they work from the perspective of us as a viewer.
Yeah. Yes, he always, looking at it, he always impressed me, you know. Brilliant.
And the drawing style as well, right?
Yeah, the drawing style. But as you say, nothing really makes sense, you know. You've got staircase going into nothing. You know, I really tried to identify with them, but it's quite brilliant. Yeah.
Okay. You Only Live Twice clip.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest set ever built.
It's going down into the volcano.
Teleport to position.
The honeymoon's over. Come on.
This volcano isn't active, is it?
It never has been. Not in my lifetime.
There's been some terrific heat here recently.
What happened?
So if we're talking about illusions, this is one of the great illusions that you've created, because you're cutting between actual footage in Japan
Right.
and then this extraordinary set that you built
Yeah.
here in London.
Yes. And Cubby Broccoli, you know, we also were in trouble because we found that Fleming hadn't really been to Japan. And we had 2 helicopters for 3 weeks flying over Japan, and we couldn't find any of the locations that Fleming talked about. And so in desperation, or also lucky, we went over Kyushu and Southern Ireland, and we found this area of actual volcanoes, incredible. And that triggered off the idea, wouldn't it be fun if the villain has his headquarters inside an extinct volcano crater? And Cubby said to me, you know, I did a quick scribble, and he said to me, how much is it going to cost? I said, Cubby, don't ask me how much is it going to cost. I have no idea. So he said, if I give you $1 million, can you do it? And I said, yes. You know. And then, of course, all my worries started, because even though $1 million in, when was it, in '66 was a fortune, but my ideas and my were rather grandiose, and I thought I was going crazy, actually. And a lot of my assistants thought of, but I had a very, very good team around me. And we managed to build that lake up there out of fiberglass, 120 feet up. And those poor plasterers with safety belts had to work day and night to get it ready. And as very often happens in my experience with the most difficult or bigger sets, less things go wrong than with a corner set of a room, and you suddenly find there's a close-up of Gina Lollobrigida or somebody in front of a badly painted door, you know. But those big sets, which cost over $1 million, everything worked, even though I had several heart attacks. I mean, not actually, but an helicopter flying into an enclosed space. Nobody had ever done it. I didn't know what was going to happen. And, well, there's so many stories. We'll be here till tomorrow morning, you know.
I think it's interesting that within 5 years, so you mentioned Dr. No cost, the whole film cost $1 million.
Yeah.
And now $1 million is being spent just on one set.
Yeah.
So already the scale of the bond is shooting up exponentially.
Yeah, because you see, they had committed, the producers had already committed to 3 months ahead to 4,000 cinemas showing the bond, and we had nothing. So, of course, they couldn't argue about money at that time, you know. And fortunately, we found this area, you know.
I actually wanted to ask you something a little bit different about Diamonds Are Forever, which fascinatingly was actually going to be played by a different actor. It was going to be John Gavin, but then at the last minute, Sean Connery came back. But a lot of it was set in Vegas and in California, around the Palm Springs area. And one of the amazing scenes is with Sean and these very agile Amazonian women. And this takes place not at one of your designs, but here at an existing piece of architecture designed by John Lautner. And I was wondering what your, I mean, at that time you were, you had almost extraordinary free reign to visit some of the most beautiful houses in that area.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't want to go into too many details because Vegas in those days, on one side you had Howard Hughes, who was up in the penthouse, and nobody knew what he looked like, but he owned half of Vegas. And the other side was owned by mobsters, you know, the Teamsters. And Cubby was a great friend of our Jews and a great friend of the Teamsters. And I was a little designer in between those two. And he said, why don't you have lunch with a certain lawyer who was a Teamster and ask him to see those great houses in Palm Springs. And I went to have lunch, and he was sitting in a corner. I had a phone board over to the phone. He said, I've got this young designer from England over, you know, show him the best houses in Palm Springs. And I was met by a black limousine, and I saw everything, and I couldn't believe it when I found this house, because I thought, this is fantastic. It's better than whatever I could think of. And the man wasn't, Arthur Edwards wasn't too happy. He said, well, who's going to pay me, and so on. I said, well, I'm only the production designer, I'm sorry, you know, but I don't. And of course, then I talked to my Teamster friend, and there were no more arguments about it, you know. We shot that house. And, but I mean, architecturally, I thought it was wonderful.
And I find Lautner's an interesting mirror character to you, it seems, because he's one of the architects whose buildings have appeared most frequently and most lovingly on film. The chemosphere here on the left, which was in Body Double, a recreation of which was in Charlie's Angels. The Sheets Goldstein house here on the right, again in Charlie's Angels 2, the Big Lebowski. I mean, it's interesting that he was an architect whose spaces seemed too fantastical to be real. They were more, it was as though they existed more on film, whereas almost what you were doing worked the other way. Everyone believed that your architecture was real, even though they were only made on film. So, I think it's, we have the Spy Love Me clip. It's our last clip.
I regret to inform you that a dangerous development has recently been brought to my notice. Someone has been attempting to sell the plans of our tracking project to competing world powers. Someone intimately associated with the project. Oh, my dear, it would perhaps be more seemly if you were to leave us. Thank you. To all the information. Now you will pay the penalty.
Primavera of Botticelli.
Once again, gentlemen, my most profound thanks. Chandor.
It's extremely playful at this point. I mean, the contrast between things that are hyper-modern, almost space age, and this extraordinary traditional neoclassical interior, which is something that constantly runs through many of your sets, which is an anti-modernist idea, where the inside should be expressed on the outside. Often they're completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was worried about that, but as an architectural training. But remember, there's some super modern interiors, which you haven't shown. Yeah, which is where Kurt Jürgens or whatever his name was living, you know. And I decided I wanted to bring this type of Italian Renaissance set, working against all the principles. Yeah, I had designed the circular set. But, and then I loved painting all these Mantegnas and the Primavera of Botticelli. I had a brilliant painter. And first of all, you had to show that it was underwater, and by raising these things. And secondly, I mean, it's maybe a little bad taste, but to show the Primavera of Botticelli and going up, and then you see the poor secretary of Blofeld or whoever it was, eaten up by a shark. But at the same time, the shark tank I liked very much as a design. But you know, you played around with all sorts of things. It doesn't mean I'm a sadist. You know?
That's the second time you said that. Talking about sadists, I think one of the things that comes through is this idea that high culture is often enjoyed, or supposedly enjoyed, by the cruelest of villains. And here on the left is Hitler's study, and on the right is Tito's living room, I believe. And I'm wondering whether, did you research or study the kind of interiors of dictators or totalitarianists or sadists?
Not at
Nothing,
all.
that's all.
Not at all. And thank God.
And you're not a sadist. Let me make
No,
this
no,
clear.
yeah, but we're almost indicating. Remember that all those things I designed tongue-in-cheek.
Yep.
And that was a saving grace, you know. And because so many people try to analyze this and say, you know, your past, and I don't think I had anything to do with the past. And because also all these villains' lairs had antique furniture or famous paintings or tapestries or something. So it wasn't that I was influenced by anything. And fortunately, when you did the interior of the volcano, nobody gets that. You must have been influenced by, well, nobody knew what the inside of a volcano looked like, including myself.
And here's an image of the
supertanker,
tanker,
right.
which was another huge set.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
also you're cutting between, is it all actual size or?
No, it was, I think, I can't remember exactly, but I had to reduce the submarine. So, you know, a nuclear submarine is about 420 feet. These were about 360 feet. But they had to look right, so it was the biggest interior set ever built at Pinewood, and I decided not to make the mistake of the crater, because after we finished shooting, the locals in Buckinghamshire complained about the ugly structure outside. So this time I built a stage around that, and it's the 007 stage, which is still there.
Still there.
Yeah, had been burned down twice.
And this is your last Bond film, Moonraker, 1979.
Yeah.
And I think what's already interesting here in this sketch with the exhaust chamber, it's almost like you're revisiting some of the elements that you'd already introduced in the previous Bond movies. This level of playfulness already with your own history, the history of the Bond films, which seems very appropriate given that it was the last Bond film that you did.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I love that set, actually. It was very, very complicated for the construction to me, because it's it's diminishing, and and also for the drafting, to do. But it worked extremely well. And have you got an actual clipping of it?
No. I
No.
don't have it.
Well, in any case, and here, yes, I designed this chamber. What was it? The rocket
Pyramid.
Yeah, the pyramid control room. And I was influenced by who was a painter? Mondrian. And but here you see it in black and white, so the colors.
Bright colors.
Yeah, and I designed all the furniture too, in plexiglass, and it worked pretty well. Yeah.
And then,
yeah,
this is extraordinary drawing. One of the projects that didn't get realized.
Yeah, that was Star Trek, to be directed by Phil Kaufman, and who had written the script, and I came up with a lot of, futuristic designs and so on. But it was too avant-garde for what was his name, the man, Roddenberry or something.
Gene Roddenberry.
Yeah, Roddenberry. And so they never made that one, and the film was made about 18 months later, not directed by Phil Kaufman or not designed by myself.
Things really changed in the late 70s. We had Star Wars in 77, and it seems by the late 70s and the early 80s, space had almost been over-designed.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether you personally found the challenge of designing things for space more free than designing things actually in the present, or the near present, as you call it.
No, well, I went to NASA to give me some ideas what they were going to come up with, and so I knew they were using these cylinders and sun panels and stuff, but I thought it's rather dull, so I came up with this mobile and completely, not very. Have you got it there? Or?
No, sorry.
Well, it's difficult to find. And the idea to make it like a mobile was when it starts rotating to create gravity. Mm-hmm. You see different angles all the time, you see. And it worked extremely well. And after that, I decided, I had enough bombs. I'd been in space, and that was it.
That was it. Okay, just the very last few slides here, and which bring us right into the present. This is a picture of your
Yes,
hallway.
You didn't ask me for permission, did you?
I snuck. I took this secretly when you were turned around. But I think what I think is interesting about this, or it makes me think that all of these things that we've seen so far this evening, these extraordinary sets, these temporary architectures, are taken down, or often the big ones are blown up spectacularly at the end of the Bond movie. And so there's no residue, it seems to me, in production design. Things come, that they exist for as long as they're needed, and then they're taken down. But there are, in terms of, this seems to me one of the few bits of existing architecture that remains of your work, and it's interesting that it's in your house.
Yes, but I don't agree with your analysis there, because in films, for me, the most important thing is that if I design something, that it is well photographed and well acted. It's a set which is the important thing. It's not my sketches or how I get there, because it's not like I'm doing architecture that has to remain for history, you know. And that is important. If the scene works in what I've designed, I think I'm very happy.
Yeah.
And here, yes, but you know these Georgian houses with a narrow wall on the right-hand side. I wanted to knock out the wall, and I created this sort of arch. And many years ago, and it's still there. And it worked.
And this is another picture that I sneakily took.
Oh, my God. Yeah.
Which has, for the last 20 years or so, been your studio in your house in Knightsbridge. And which is very different because obviously you've mentioned time after time that all these extraordinary things that we saw were done because of these amazing teams that you had. And it always interested me that the credits for films often probably mirror the credits for buildings. If you look at, film credits can go on for minutes. Hundreds and hundreds of people are enlisted to make something happen. And often it's the same with architecture. And but then over the last few years, you've been working on I just brought up a couple of projects which I thought would be a nice way to end. This was Electronic Arts, the computer games company who approached you, who were doing a sort of montage of Bond, different Bond films. And this was your foray into the kind of digital realm. Did you find this an interesting?
Yeah, I found it interesting, but I'm a complete idiot, you know, because I haven't got one of these, I haven't got a computer and so on. I've got a fax. But I unfortunately couldn't send them faxes in color, you see. So I had a young assistant who could send them in color. So I did these sketches, sent them to Hollywood. And it worked, you see. Except that sometimes when they sent me back what in films we would call the dailies or rushes, but the DVDs, it was different to what I designed or something. When I did the interior of the gold vaults of Fort Knox, I didn't see any gold. I said, are they out of their mind, you know? And immediately on the phone to Hollywood, I said, what the devil is happening? Where's the gold? I said, well, we can't deal with the reflection. Remember, that's 4 or 5 years ago, and they couldn't. Now they can, you see. So those were disappointing experiences. But at the same time, it was exciting to work in a new media, too. You know.
And the very last project that I'd like to show, which is actually how we got to know each other.
That's right.
Which a private client approached you nearly 2 years ago now, I think.
Right.
And suggested, would you like to build well, I think originally he said, would you like to build a house for him? And you said,
no.
No. No, thank you. And then he said, how about a pavilion? And a pavilion you thought was an interesting project, particularly maybe in light of the pavilions that you'd seen going up in the Serpentine.
Yeah, it was fascinating, and I was very fortunate to have 2 young architects who are here working with me eventually. Unfortunately, the financing didn't materialize, and so it was just an idea.
And this is an image, so you collaborated with Alan Dempsey on the right. And again, I think this, was it interesting to see your sketches, your drawings, which were all done by hand, be translated into this digital, three-dimensional form?
Yeah. Fantastic, I was very impressed. And the only other experience I ever had was when I was invited by Norman Foster to see his setup. And there were between 600 and 800 architects sitting in front of their computers, you see. But they didn't, you know, I'm used to drawing boards, and they maybe had a scribbling pad. Everything else was done. I couldn't believe it, you see. And I think there's a great deal in computer architecture, but I can immediately recognize when architecture is done through a computer rather than it's
started.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is the last slide, and I just want to quote something that you wrote once, which was, "No design is worth doing if you just reproduce reality. I don't believe that you can get a sense of reality by copying. The fantasy is more acceptable and believable to the public." Would you say that perhaps somehow encapsulates your approach to cinema, to design?
Yeah. But I'm not the originator of that idea, because if you see some of the early films of Hollywood, of Cecil Gibbons, who designed these incredible, I mean, maybe not he himself, but it's this Art Deco interiors with women in Balenciaga dresses and men in tails and so on, was completely unreal for the American public, but they loved it because it was escapism. And that is what I felt I have given the public. And they accepted my ideas as reality, complete departures from reality. And I think that a designer has to, has to be able to do.
I think everyone here this evening will agree that you've done it for all of us, and we're hugely grateful for your work. And I'm sorry we've run out of time, so we don't have time for questions, but please join me in thanking Sir Ken Adam for really extraordinary insight into his work. Thank you.
What's the time?